Thank you so much for having me, and I really appreciate everyone who's here attending. Uh, as Alison said, I work in the suicide prevention team at Origin, but before I did that, I started my PhD looking at international student exchange programs and the different outcomes of those programs. So I have quite a wide interest in international education experiences in general. And what I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about the experiences I've had or the studies that I've done in that area and look at how we can potentially take research from the heavier end of mental health, so suicide prevention, right through to the really positive ends of flourishing and things like that, that tends to come out of short-term mobility programs, or that's what the research is on, and look at how we could work across that continuum to support international students to have the best possible mental health outcomes while studying in Australia. Let me just make sure that I'm not driving my slides right now. So here we go. So one thing that I wanted to flag from the outset, and it's an interesting thing that I've observed, is that when we look at international education, there's two main areas of research. The first of these is short-term mobility programs, so student exchange, these sorts of things that tend to be people from wealthy countries transitioning into other countries that of different levels of wealth and prosperity and things like that, but they tend to have a lot of resources, and the research focuses on positive experiences, positive outcomes, and there's much less focus on negative outcomes or negative mental health. So to give you some examples, here's a few journal titles or like research article titles that kind of highlight the positives. So it's like, identity development, multicultural effectiveness, skills and European identity, personality development, social relationship experiences. And then there was a big systematic review that was done that was basically said there's three main positive sorts of outcomes, so cultural, personal, and employment related. So in terms of research around this area, we tend to get the good sort of things. Now, when we flip it into international students, the research tends to focus much more on the bad side of things. So negative experiences, negative mental health outcomes, and that sort of thing. So similarly, here we've got sort of international students and mental health symptoms and disorders among international students, mental health and physical safety, opportunities to improve mental health, health and well-being of international students. So that's one area, but it's also focusing on challenges and Asian international students and suicide in the United States. So just kind of flagging that we've got these sort of two ends of the spectrum, depending on what types of student groups that we're researching. And the reason I'm flagging that is that because, as I said at the start, my research sits across both, I wanted to set that up so that you see that from the outset as kind of a framework to think about potential ways we can support students across both positive or taking them from the negative, more challenging areas through to flourishing. So how can we use the research to reduce suicide risk and improve students' mental health and well-being? Well, first, let me tell you a little bit about my PhD research that I did. So I assessed identity development and a variety of other outcomes in French and Australian exchange students. I spent 2 years living in Bordeaux, which was pretty amazing. But also, I think it's something that's worth sort of flagging in terms of lived experience sort of ideas. Living in Bordeaux, I went to Bordeaux with limited French. And as you all know, in the English learning space, students going to another culture, another place with a limited native language capacity, it can be super challenging. And I honestly spent the first 3 months at the University of Bordeaux sitting in a lunchroom with all the other PhD students, feeling so isolated because I couldn't understand. And I sat through that discomfort until I was able to understand and had some of the best experiences of my life. But it was a really tough initial sort of transition into that space. Anyway, there was it was a very technical piece of work, but basically what I was able to find was that exchange promoted positive identity development, so people's sense of self got stronger. It enhanced cultural intelligence, so people became more capable of working with and understanding people from different cultures, and it improved how they felt about their lives, so they felt more positive about their lives. So very positive sort of outcomes. And I can share all this research with you at the end. In terms of the experiences, so what actually happened on exchange that drove these positive outcomes, things like independent problem solving when facing adversity. So in exchange students, particularly from places like Australia, it's the middle of the night when something goes wrong. So then they have to overcome the problems themselves. So they can't call mum and dad to get that support. And that feels like a really big deal when they do that. And most of the time they do that relatively successfully. Cultural learning, so learning about other places, other people, other ways of life, and trying new activities, so actually trying out different things, and then changing social networks and reflecting on all of these different processes were really those things that helped promote all of these more positive outcomes. Now, one of the other things that we showed with this research was that attitude was central to supporting positive outcomes. So basically, students told us that the students who did best while abroad were those who embraced the opportunity, who said yes to opportunities, and also said, if I face adversity, it's part and parcel of the journey, but that's actually a really positive growth opportunity. So that attitude was a really important one for managing those different challenges that come up for anyone while they're living and studying in another country. So what does all of this tell us as a first sort of point of call? Well, in terms of outcomes and processes, exchange, it seems to prevent this developmentally relevant challenges and opportunities for growth and development. And I didn't talk too much about this, but those with resources but less prior development seem to get the most out of the experience. So those who've got the capacity to meet the challenges that come up, but have done less of that sort of, for example, identity development previously, tend to get the best sort of experiences. And what this sort of flags in terms of opportunities for intervention is that we could actually take some of these key findings, so supporting people to manage problems independently, promoting that attitude of openness and positive risk-taking, and those reflective processes. Other sort of peer support programs may also help. Now, in terms of negative outcomes for international students, and this is where we sort of start to flip things, there's a lot of mental health issues that have been identified for students studying in another country. And these seem to be linked to potentially students coming in with existing mental health issues, but also being exacerbated by having to adapt and manage living abroad. So students tend to often experience depression and anxiety. In terms of suicide risk, they are less likely to report feeling suicidal, but more likely to make suicide attempts than domestic students. And there seems to be specific differences between different groups. So for instance, Asian international students are more likely to report suicide-related thoughts and behaviours than other groups. Now, there is an extensive range of risk factors identified, including language, academic and financial difficulties, loneliness, and problems of acculturation, sense of being a burden, etc. So we've got these outcomes, and we've also got these potential risk factors. And I want to talk about that more shortly when we go into sort of ways we might be able to better support international students. So one of the things that we did to try and address this was, because I'm in the suicide prevention team, was to look at doing a scoping review around suicide prevention, specifically for international students. And we asked, what is the extent, range, and nature of the evidence regarding suicide prevention for international students? And what suicide prevention strategies are promising for preventing suicide in this group? Now, I won't go into the details, but I will go into the findings. This paper, you can read the whole thing if you'd like as well. And as I said, I'll share everything at the end. So in terms of interventions, what we found was that there is no evidence-based studies on suicide prevention, specifically for international students at this time. So this was in the peer-reviewed and what we call the grey literature. So peer-reviewed being academic or science-based articles, the grey literature being government reports, other things like that. And so given this lack of studies assessing interventions, we've focused on the existing recommendations. So what do people say we should do to prevent suicide for international students? And there was 4 main groups. So we had cultural competency training on suicide and the provision of culturally sensitive services, improved and increased risk screening for suicide, proactive intervention and engagement strategies, and collaborative approaches to streamline service access and improve available supports. So I'll go into each of these in a little bit of detail now. So in terms of cultural competency training, there was 2 parts to this. First, it was the groups. So essentially people said anyone working with international students might need some additional training in how to address mental health, how to understand when mental health issues might be occurring, these sorts of things. So, and when I say anyone, it could be education staff, it could be administrative supports, it could be housing support staff or those who work with international students not directly within the education setting, anyone who's involved in the international education sector and directly engaging with students. So now, in terms of training topics, obviously this was suicide specific, but they included suicide risk signs, international student specific risk factors, so things like that they stop coming to class or they're not engaging with other international students, or a whole range of other ones that come up. Barriers to help seeking, so things that might block them. And this was something that unfortunately a lot of it came out from the work of the Victorian coroner who looked into international student suicide and identified that there's systematic barriers across the entire system that makes it much more difficult for international students to access services, which may increase that risk of suicide, unfortunately. And so I think this is something just to flag, because I'm sure you're aware of these. And as I move into the next section down the line, what I'm going to do is bring up ways we could potentially intervene that are more, how should I put it, that are things that we can do at an education level, or that you can do at an education provider level, because you can't, as an education provider, address these systemic issues of health access, housing, or stresses like that, these more systemic sort of issues. Anyway, the last other training topic related to the provision of culturally sensitive services, but this was generally in relation to counselling services rather than health education providers directly, but counselling services within education settings. Now, in terms of improved and increased risk screening, I want to just flag that risk screening is a somewhat controversial topic. It's important, but we can't put too much weight on saying, well, someone's scored this on a particular measure of suicide risk, therefore we will need to put them through this specific set of interventions or supports. It should be as a tool of identifying potential risk and then engaging with that person further to look at what's going on and how we can best help them. So with increased risk screening, there was one focus around mental health centre intake, and then also just more generally within the community. So once again, those people who work with international students. And what we often talk about with this sort of thing is what's called gatekeeper training. So training people to have the skills to recognize signs of suicide in others and to be able to start that safe conversation to get them the supports they may need. Now, in terms of other things we could do, we need measures in multiple languages. I'm sure you all appreciate that. And measures that are more relevant to international student-specific issues. In terms of proactive intervention and engagement, there was a couple of things that came out, particularly things around orientation programs, so including more mental health information around during orientation, and then information campaigns targeting specific issues around things like misconceptions of mental health or different cultural perceptions of mental health, issues around help seeking. So historically, and what the evidence suggests, is that a lot of international students are unwilling to seek help because they're concerned about the potential negative ramifications, whether that's visa ramifications, education issues, family perceptions. There's a whole lot of barriers for international students seeking professional help. And then other issues, such as things with issues with challenges with acculturation. And what was once again suggested was this multi-language psychoeducation material. So really providing supports in the specific languages that students are speaking that they're most comfortable speaking, because often when regardless of how high your level of English might be, as I'm sure you're once again aware, you can have great English in one specific area, but suddenly moving into, say, mental health, where you may not even have a word for something like depression, can make it really, really complex to then negotiate that whole process. Now, peer-based approaches were another really important one, and I'll talk about that a little bit more because we've got a peer-based program that we're working on, so I'll talk about that more in a couple of minutes. And then, as per usual, we all need more money to do this sort of work. In terms of collaborative approaches, this sort of thing is probably less relevant, but just something to be aware of. So when I talk about collaborative approaches, we need, once again, those streamlined pathways that allow an international student who has a mental health issue to know that they can go from a health service, let's say, whether that's a GP at the university or the education setting, through to further supports as they're needed, that they can be stepped along that process with as much support as they need, because often there's so many barriers that they might get through the first step. So they've overcome all of those issues around help seeking. They've managed to get themselves there. They get through the door, but then that first door is open, but then subsequent doors are closed. So we really do need to have pathways that allow them to get that ongoing support. And that requires collaboration. So now that I've kind of overviewed some of this research, what I wanted to do is talk about how we could use this research to guide potential interventions. And so when we look at what I've been talking about, we've got sort of a continuum of potential outcomes that come from international education. On that very bottom end, we've got things like suicide and poor mental health. On the very top end, we've got increased well-being and a whole lot of other positive things that are really valuable to young people as they sort of try and work out who they are and what they want to do in their lives. Now, we can break down how we get from the impact or the risk factors, protective factors, and promotive factors that can support these types of outcomes. And when I talk about risk factors, I'm talking about factors that might increase the likelihood that someone will experience poor mental health or thoughts of suicide or attempt suicide. Now, these sorts of things, they don't guarantee. So when I say they increase the likelihood, but they're not guaranteed reasons that people will experience that. There's so much variation in this sort of area that while you might have 10 of the risk factors, you still may not have poor mental health, for example. So just to kind of flag that. The second thing that we've got is protective factors. So these are ones that decrease the likelihood of negative outcomes. And then on the other side, we can talk about promotive factors. So these are ones that promote the likelihood of positive development or flourishing sort of outcomes. So when we think about this, I think it's just a really good way to kind of conceptualize how we might support people to move from one end of that spectrum through to the other. And so then what we can do is consider potential types of interventions. And what I was wondering is, well, how can we have, let's say, the biggest bang for our buck? And one of the ways I think we can think about this is to actually think, well, if we run an intervention, will it reduce? So here I've got sort of this idea of, I'll put this little laser pointer here, this idea of reducing risk factors, increasing protective factors, and then even potentially increasing these promotive factors. So something like social supports or these peer support programs, buddy programs, and other interventions that promote connection, they will potentially reduce things like loneliness. They'll help with things like potentially campus connectedness and social support. And they may promote new social networks where people can learn and develop and discover, say, the Australian culture or other cultures and groups. So you could do a similar thing thinking about mental health promotion. So, I talked about this idea that we need mental health promotion to support different outcomes or better mental health outcomes or reduce suicide risk. So things like gatekeeper training and things like that might reduce some of these risk factors because you might identify people who are at risk, and that's sort of also protective in a way that you've created a community who might reduce the risk of suicide. These things tend to do less towards those promotive factors unless you were to bring in something like coping skills training, which might help people with independent problem solving, which, as I said earlier, was one of those key factors that promoted growth during student exchange. And then the last one I wanted to flag was sort of acculturation training. It's commonly talked about in this area, but this might reduce things like acculturation problems and a whole lot of other sort of things that come with that. And it can improve the way that people adapt and then learn about the new culture and process all of that learning, which might promote growth and development, which, as I said, was what happened in what I found in my thesis or my PhD. Probably has less impact on these protective factors though. So I just wanted to show this as a bit of a model of thinking about, well, depending on the ways that you might want to have an impact with your work, depending on how you might want to improve or where you want to, the issues you want to target and the kind of outcomes you're hoping for, you can sort of think, well, do I want to target risk, protective or promotive factors? Do I want to target a number of those? And which programs then would be most suited to addressing each of those? So a couple of programs that we're running at the moment, I just wanted to give a quick overview of. So the first of that is we're adapting a program called Safe Talk, which is a suicide alertness training. It's a little bit like gatekeeper training that I mentioned earlier, but just a little bit, it's quite short, so it's only 3.5 hours, but it teaches people how to recognize signs of suicide in themselves and others and start a safe conversation to get the support they might need. And so we are adapting that for international students at the moment by working with international students. And then we're going to assess that later in the year. And so potentially if you're a college in Victoria, because this is where we've got the funding, you might, and you've got say 25 students who might be interested in completing it, we could offer this training at your college later in the year to be evaluated for free. So just something I wanted to flag, but also a really important piece of work about building that community of international students who are aware of suicide and the suicide risk signs and these sorts of things. We actually already completed that first co-design workshop, and the students who came, obviously they were an engaged group, the students who come to something like this, but they were incredibly positive and said that they really felt like it should be something that's part of the initial orientation programs, or that there should be more of this sort of mental health training at orientation, because even with these students who were incredibly engaged, they still, many of them held those misconceptions around mental health and help seeking. For instance, they were all worried that they might have visa issues if they were to access services. They weren't aware of potential services that were available. So these sorts of things, even in the most engaged students, are clearly creating challenges. So this is, I think, a really good opportunity to start to build a community who's more aware of what's available and the sorts of ways that they can get support. The other thing that we're doing, which can also have a similar impact, is the student mental health peer work program. So basically, peer work is where people, such as international students or anyone with a lived experience of mental ill health or those sorts of things, provide support to other students going through, or others going through similar experiences. And there's a really strong evidence based around the value of this work, but not with international students. So there was an initial trial conducted by Origin that was positive, and now we're doing a full evaluation. And so we should have more about this later in the year, but it is looking really promising that it can have a really positive impact on international students, both those who are delivering the peer work and the international students accessing the services. So a couple of final thoughts to finish things off. International education is associated with both positive and negative outcomes. And one way I like to look at these sort of international education is like it's a context that it multiplies existing resources. So people who are there who've got good resources, i.e. students on exchange, they might experience really positive outcomes because they get some challenges, but they've got the resources to meet them. For those who don't, maybe international students with less resources, they might come up against these challenges. And if they aren't able to meet them for whatever reason, then they're stuck feeling even worse than what they were before. So finding ways that we can support those with less resources may be really important. We can use research to identify potential interventions that address those risk, protective and promotive factors, like I said, and I think this is a really good model and way of thinking about ways that we can best meet students' needs. But we do need more research on interventions because there's been quite a limited amount done. And really what we need to be able to do, regardless of what work we're doing, is to be able to meet students where they are, and so that we can support them in the way that they need, in a way that's accessible to them as well. So then they feel comfortable and seen and considered in that process, so that they actually get the support that's relevant and valuable and that they can engage with. But that's all that I wanted to say. So thank you very much for listening. And now if you've got any questions, I'd be more than happy to chat them through.
Thank you very much, Sam. That was really informative, and I really love those, the ideas you're talking about, the safe talk and the peer work. I'm just going to look here into the chat and see if we've got any questions there. So just give me a moment. I like the idea as well, you said around the gatekeeper and safe conversations. So I do have maybe a question myself on that one. One question I often hear asked is the fear of raising the subject of suicide with someone puts that idea of suicide in their head. What is your take on that? So often people are afraid to use that word.
Yeah, so this is something that comes up regularly across all of our work.
Mm-hmm.
So we work across a variety of settings, and the international student work is one of my primary focuses, but I also work in high schools. We work in emergency departments. We work across so many settings with young people in particular in our team. And this question comes up time and time again, and this concern that if you say, are you having thoughts of suicide? If that person's not doing well and they hadn't thought about suicide previously, suddenly now they're going to feel suicidal and they're going to be like, oh, that's what I needed. Now I'm going to be feeling like that. And in fact, the evidence tells us that that's not at all true. So there is no evidence out there that says that asking someone about suicide will make them feel suicide. On the contrary, what it does is it actually tends to reduce risk because you might be able to identify that they are feeling suicidal. And one way to think about this is to say, well, in fact, people aren't that gullible. You know, people, you're not going to be able to, you can't say, well, have you ever considered going for a different footy team? And then they're like, oh, there we go. Now I'm going to go for the other footy team, you know. So
Mm-hmm.
similar sorts of ideas. And really, when we look at suicide as a bigger picture, it's an outcome of people feeling really really bad, and it's a last sort of resort of this is the only way I can make myself potentially, I can't cope anymore, this is where I'm going. And so people get there through a whole lot of ways, but it's not through people asking, are you having thoughts of suicide? So I think the real key message that we try to share around this is to say, ask if you're worried about someone, ask directly and clearly. Don't beat around the bush. Don't say, oh, are you feeling a bit, are you having thoughts of doing something silly to yourself or these
Mm-hmm.
sorts of things? Be clear and direct and actually say, well, look, it looks like this might be happening for you. Are you having thoughts of suicide? And then you can go from there. Now, I do want to acknowledge one thing,
Mm-hmm.
and this is that culturally, for certain cultures, asking clearly and directly may be very confronting. And if you're aware of that, you need to be able to use your judgment. It's not that you don't get to that question, but when I say ask clearly and directly, you might still want to just take a little bit of time to go through the culturally relevant processes of talking through these issues, engaging with the person, rather than just jumping straight in and being like, are you having thoughts of suicide? And that's something that came out in those co-design workshops that we're talking about, that even some of the students there were saying, look, we totally want to get there, but culturally I can't go straight to that point. I have to spend a bit of time in that space with the person before I start asking. So that's just a bit of a caveat, but definitely shouldn't be worried about asking.
Nice. Okay. Thank you very much for that one.
That's okay.
I'm just checking if we have any other questions in there. Any other questions from, okay, might have one there. Okay, so we've got one in here. Sam, can you tell us about the availability or lack of multi-language resources around suicide awareness and prevention? This is aimed at specifically international student groups. So that was a question there. Can you tell
Yeah.
us about?
So I think there really isn't a huge amount, unfortunately. So there's some print materials, things like that, that are
Mm-hmm.
available. As was kind of flagged in that question, that there was some stuff that came along that was relevant in terms of other migrant groups. It looks like Robert has got some print materials that's happy to share, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
In general, there's often not a massive amount in multiple languages unless it's been done for the general migrant population in Australia. And that's something that we're hoping to improve in general. So yeah, there's not as many resources out there that are specific to international students and their experiences as we'd like.
Okay.
Oh, So Robert's saying I don't have print materials, but looking,
Oh,
yeah. So yes, no. So I think unfortunately there isn't enough in multi-languages at this stage, and it's an area that we definitely need to do more work on.
okay. Thank you for that one. And we have another one here as well. Does self-harm usually come before a suicide attempt?
So this is a really interesting area. It depends. Self-harm is a strong predictor of, it's not guaranteed, but it is a strong predictor of future suicide attempts. The thing that's really complex, and this is really part of the issue, is that there's this idea of non-suicidal self-injury, which is that people are self-harming with no intent to die. And that's because they're trying to manage pain. It's a coping strategy of one form or another. They cut themselves, these sorts of things. Now, that sort of intention, it's incredibly hard to separate out that intention from how someone's feeling. And the thing of feelings of suicide can go up and down within minutes, within days, across time. So there's this such variation here that it's incredibly difficult to separate out. So while self-harm can be a predictor of suicide risk, it doesn't always precurse suicide. So it's not always a precursor because people do attempt suicide without any previous self-harm attempts, so or previous self-harm behaviors. So look, it's something to look out for, and it's an important marker of something that you might want to look out for if you were worried about someone, but it's not going to be the only way that we might be able to identify suicide risk in someone.
Okay, all right. We've got one more question here as well from Sherry. Do we ask students prior to coming to a new country whether they have pre-existing mental health issues? Is this something that we should be asking?
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting one, and it's a difficult one, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
if you don't want people to be stigmatized,
Mm-hmm.
because the reality is the country we live in, we might be relatively progressive, but there's still a massive amount of stigma around mental health. People, local Australians are also worried about talking about their mental health, often are uncomfortable seeking help for it. And that having a mental health issue can be equated with being seen as having problems, you know? And so people don't want that, and that label in particular. So I think we need to find a way that's sensitive to look at potential issues without putting specific labels on people unless they're open to that. I do think it would be valuable in some ways to know if people might have pre-existing issues, because as I said, this entering a new place, entering a new culture, adapting to a new country, particularly for students studying in Australia where costs are very high, often they have a whole lot of people behind them supporting them. So they have these incredible pressures to perform, and they don't want to, um, they don't, they don't want to let people down. They don't want to, they don't want to even be seen as like it's for them, it's a problem to be seen as not doing well because they're getting so much, right? So for
Mm-hmm.
that, having that existing identification of some sort of potential risk would be really helpful because then we can actually tailor supports to them. But I would be very hesitant to say that should be a universal approach because then you run the risk of this sort of labeling and things. And I think that a lot of students potentially wouldn't answer honestly because of all of these potential concerns that might come up.
Okay, thank you. I think we've got one more there from Sherry. Could you ask that all medication, puffers, antidepressants, etc., be reported to the school? And we have,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. So I think it would be, once again, this sort of information would be really helpful for us to have,
Mm,
but I don't think we can ask it. I think in this situation, there'd be legal
yeah, legal
ramifications as
grounds.
well.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is also why, it's one of the concerns that come up with suicide in general, that once you identify suicide risk, then there's a responsibility to do something about it. So for instance, even in research that we do, right, sometimes you would not include a measure of suicide risk, not because you don't want to know, but the extensive workload that comes with what happens when someone's identified at risk and what supports do you link them in with and all of these sorts of things means that you need to have a pathway, a support pathway, resources, etc., in place that mean so that you can provide the relevant supports. And so it is something that, once again, it's wonderful if we can find ways that are relevant, that work, that are context dependent, that will work in your setting, that allows students to feel safe to communicate relevant information so that they can get the supports they need. And maybe that's about creating an environment that's safe, that addresses potential concerns around visa ramifications or other things like that, and says, or for example, peer work programs where international students say, I struggled with this, this, and this, and these are the ways that I got through it. And maybe you're feeling similar. If you are, come and have a chat with me, breaking it down that way. And then that would be a way to do it rather than collecting routine information that may have all of these other ramifications and requirements that make it really complex to actually, and resource intensive, that goes beyond what most colleges could provide.
Okay, thank you very much, Sam, for answering all of those questions. I did fire quite a few at you there. We've got a few more in the chat box, but we'll leave it there for now. And maybe if you want to have a look as well, you might be able to answer them in there. I'm going to move on now over to Trish, hand it over to Trish to take the wheel. Thank you so much, Sam, again for delivering that wonderful presentation.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Alison, and thank you so much from me again as well, Sam. That was a really, really insightful plenary. So thank you so much.